But I can tell you, I've spoken to some people in the Senate, and they don't disagree. All right, folks. So as we all know, the deal is off between Canada and the United States. The deal that both sides were basically saying is a done deal. And it was rushing towards the finish line. And at the last second, everything blew apart. So what really happened? We don't know if we can tell you what really happened, but we can tell you some of what we found out. And then we'll tell you what we think happened in terms of why it happened. So let's take a look. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to a publication to the south. It's from the New York Times, folks. This is called Fair Dealing because we're actually attributing where we're getting this from. Trump's top trade representative details offer that Canada rejected. In an interview, Jamieson Greer, President Trump's trade representative, laid out details of what the United States offered to Canada before talks crumbled.
Mr. Trump had abruptly threatened Canada with a 50% tariff on about $20 billion of its exports in July in an effort to push the country into making trade concessions and removing certain practices the United States had deemed unfair. Those tariffs were set to go into effect on the morning of August 19th, but on the night before, Mr. Trump delayed the tariffs until August 22nd, saying that the countries had a deal, quote, subject to the finalization of documents, end quote. But over the following days, and particularly late into the night, Friday, that consensus crumbled. It fell apart over a series of issues that, individually, may have seemed small, but collectively represented a big division over issues of importance to both sides. Mr. Greer, who is the ambassador of trade, I believe, Mr. Greer said that the Trump administration had pledged to eliminate the 10% tariff on softwood lumber that Mr. Trump imposed last year during a provision known as Section 232. The United States had also offered to reduce a 25% tariff on cars that Mr. Trump put in place last year. But because Canada qualifies for a further reduction when the cars contain any amount of U.S. content, the automotive tariffs could have gone as low as 7%, he said. The United States also offered to lower tariffs on metals, one of Canada's most important priorities. Quote, the United States was prepared to reduce the tariff on steel from 50% to 25% for the majority of steel Canada sent to the United States, end quote, Mr. Greer said. Steel would be subject to what is known as a tariff rate quota system, in which only a certain amount of steel imports would receive that lower tariff. On aluminum, the United States had offered to reduce its tariffs to 25% from 50% without such a quota limitation, Mr. Greer said. For products made with steel and aluminum, like golf clubs and beer cans, the United States offered to cut those tariffs by anywhere from 10 to 25 percentage points, with the lowest tariffs set at 15%.
Now, here's the most interesting part of this entire article, folks.
The Canadian government did not immediately respond to a request to comment on Mr. Greer's description of what Canada had left on the table when it suspended talks Friday evening. Isn't that interesting?
So, this is just what Greer's saying. And what the Conservatives are doing, I think, is the right thing. They are calling on Mr. Carney to show us the deal.
Right, because right now, all we have to go on are the Americans' statement, right? There's always two sides to every story, so let's hear what the Canadian delegation, i.e. Dominic LeBlanc and, Carney's people, what they have to say, what they said the deal was and why they left it on the table.
And I would argue that there's no breaching any sort of confidentiality because Jamieson Greer, he flat out told the New York Times what his interpretation of what was actually in that deal was. So let's hear what the deal was. Now, Mark Carney is trying to say, well, they were trying to dictate how we do trade and all this stuff. Whereas, you can talk about that because there's some stipulations inside of CUSMA that it does influence how you can do trade.
Yes, it does. And we reviewed that a little while ago, actually.
Right. And Mario, he actually put out a video earlier today talking about that. So, but this is why we need to see the language. This is why we need to see the deal itself. I will say I'm not going to trust Mr. Greer, and I'm not going to trust Mr. Carney because this is now hearsay on both sides. Show us the deal. I can't call up the U.S. government and say, where's our deal? Because we're in Canada. So we have to call up Mr. Carney and say, show us the deal. And if we are now going into a situation where it's 50% tariffs on all of these products, over 20 billion, some say as high as $30 billion in goods, I would think that that would classify a reason to go back to Parliament now.
Or to not leave the negotiating table in the first place. Like you can say, okay, we're clearly not agreeing. Let's break for the night and come back in the morning.
Well, and if you're that close.
Right. That's my point. Like you don't, like to me, anyways, this is an opinion. This is my opinion. You don't leave until that deal gets done because those 50% tariffs are going to be so significant.
And here's the thing. Let's just, for the sake of argument, let's say Mark Carney is completely telling the truth. Let's just go with that. I know. Let's just go with that, though. So at the negotiating table, which he wasn't at, by the way, it was Dominic LeBlanc. Let's say you're stuck on these things. And the Americans are saying, no, we need this. Well, no, like we need this. Well, no, we need this. We need this. The best thing to do is to say, guys, okay, listen, we're almost here. Can we all agree to take a break? We're all tired. We're almost there. Let's go back. Let's chat with our country leaders. Let's come back to this tomorrow. Can we get an extension by another day? Because we're almost there. Let's not throw away all the progress that we've been working towards.
Right. And that's the way I would do it. Now, again, I wasn't in the room. I don't know if that's possible. But to me, yes, you don't have to accept a bad deal, but you need to continue working together to get a deal that is at least acceptable to both sides.
That's what I would have done. Now, this is interesting because CBC actually had somebody on their show that was saying what Mark Carney was doing was insanity.
You, of course, were a former advisor to BC and Ontario on NAFTA. I just wonder, Barry Appleton, what do you make of this? 50% tariff, $27 billion worth of Canadian goods now in effect. There is an absolute trust fracture in this relationship. What are the sort of options available to Canada here? What's your initial assessment of the situation?
Okay, look, first of all Canadians feel today is like the day after Pearl Harbor. So none of us are happy. And this is a foundational shift. But we have to think about being smart, not just dealing with our emotions. And so part of the problem we have is this. Dollar for dollar retaliation is math. It's actually not strategy. The Bank of Canada did a major report, came out in June of this year, talking about the impact of the last time we did retaliation. What they found was that the impact of retaliation cost Canadians when that came in and didn't have any impact on the Americans because we're too small. So while it feels good and sounds good, it causes a problem. But here's the other problem. Inside, and the devil here is in the details, inside Section 338, the proclamations that put this into account, there's a provision that says that the president has the authority to block American goods if there's retaliation. So there's already a clause, we call that a snapback. There's a clause in there with a punishment to warn anybody to not do this. So the Prime Minister's smart. He's put this out. He said, look, I'm going to give you a warning, which is not going to be effective until September the 8th. So he's telling everybody what the cost will be. But actually, the cost of retaliation could be a lot worse than we expect because the president alone, not going to Congress, has special powers that we've never had exposed to us before. So that's the first really important point we need to understand. Even though it makes us feel good, and we can vote in lots of ways because we cannot buy American. We can use consumer power. But if you engage in this, the president has special powers, and I don't see any reason why he wouldn't use them. Plus, he can also put in another 338 on us.
That was fascinating to hear. And the report is real, because we found it. But the big irony about this is that Mark Carney used to be the governor of the Bank of England. Mark
And
Carney
Canada too.
used to be the governor of the Bank of Canada. So this report came out recently, and maybe at some point he will claim that he authored it. I don't know. But
he authored all reports ever in the history of man.
And all future ones.
Yes.
But here is the report that they're actually talking about. So this is a report of the Bank of Canada, the price impact of Canadian retaliatory tariffs. Okay, fine. So this is the section. It's a long report, but this is the section that I want to show you. And I want to direct your attention here. It says, evidence from Canadian international merchandise trade data shows little systemic decline in the prices received by U.S. exporters of tariffed products, suggesting limited absorption by foreign exporters.
So what does that mean?
What does that mean? So what this means, folks, is that when there was dollar for dollar tariffs last year, there was for about 6 months before Mark Carney took them all off. What ended up happening is the American exporters shipped their products into Canada. Remember, they don't necessarily pay the tariff. By default, they don't. So it goes into Canada. What was happening is that the retailers and the companies in Canada, they were paying most of it. So there's 25% tariff on it, but the price is they didn't actually go up that much. Now, the thought is because the retailers thought that this was actually not going to last very long, so they didn't worry about it. But then it did. And they only went up by about 6% in price in Canada. What didn't happen is the longer it went on, the exporters did not absorb any of that tariff cost whatsoever. What does that mean? Look at what is happening in the mold tool and die industry in Canada. They need to keep their customers. They need to continue doing business. And their primary market is the United States. In order to keep their customers, they absorb the cost of the tariffs in order to do that. If they didn't, their business would be gone overnight. That's the problem. Because otherwise, it's a 15% total markup on every single product, because they're being tariffed the total value of the product that's going over the border. So what this report is saying is that the American companies weren't concerned whether or not their products sold in Canada, and as a result of these tariffs, which means that we account for such a small amount of their sales, it didn't matter. And because of that, he's saying that the only people paying are Canadians, because we're paying the extra tariff on all these products. You're making it more unaffordable for Canadians in Canada, and you may actually cause people not to buy any of the products in the first place, which means you're hurting the Canadian businesses that are trying to sell them in Canada. That's what this report is saying, and that's what Mr. Appleton is saying on CTV or CBC. So he's saying, yeah, this may feel good to do this, but it's not going to have the impact on American businesses that you think it's going to have.
Well, and tariffs in general, if you're going to put tariffs on another country, you need to be very strategic about which country, what items, because you need to have items that you produce them at home, but you produce them maybe for a little bit more money at home than you do coming from the United States, let's say. So if you're putting tariffs on things that the United States only makes, or that's where you get the bulk of that product. For example, let's just use one, like orange juice. We don't have orange trees in Canada. So if you're putting tariffs on something like orange juice, you're affecting the people in your country, because anybody who wants orange juice is now paying more because it's not something you can make at home.
Yeah, you can't get another orange juice supplier in Canada.
Right.
Because we don't grow them here.
Right, exactly. So you have to apply tariffs strategically to make it so that the product coming into your country is a little bit more money now than the product that is made in your country, therefore incentivizing people to buy the product that is made domestically in your country.
Now, we go to Shuf Majumdar now, who is on CBC, And he was being asked about this.
You heard there, and you well know your party's position. Your party wants to see a deal with no tariffs at all. I'm sure everyone would like to see that too, but is that really realistic, seeing as President Trump has seen tariffs as a way for his government to raise money?
You know, it's interesting you asked that question. I would also point out former Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland's interview on Bloomberg today, where she described a structural weakness of tariffs that are one-sided. Unilateral, one-sided tariffs that are focused on deindustrializing our economy is an existential risk to the country. And the Prime Minister had promised a better deal, a deal that would be good for the Canadian all aluminum workers, lumber workers, steel workers, and other manufacturing, auto workers. The permanent disadvantage of permanent tariffs is an obvious concern that premiers would have, that the opposition has, and I'm sure Mr. Carney's own caucus has when it comes to the direction that he's taking these negotiations. Of course, we haven't seen the deal yet. I think it's probably important for us to take a measure of what is ultimately announced, if it is announced, and then have a chance to respond accordingly.
Since you brought up Chrystia Freeland, she also, though, said in that interview that while no one's happy to see some kind of permanent tariff there, she did say that will also be a bad deal for both countries.
Yep.
And she also said, though, that a deal at least would provide some certainty for businesses, even if it kind of sticks in our craw that we're having to accept tariffs. So is that not sort of a bigger picture of just saying this is not great to having tariffs? I mean, I think everyone agrees it's not great to have tariffs, but it's what we have to accept, it seems.
And that's exactly the fair point to make, because here we are a year and a half into the Prime Minister's tenure, where we've had plenty of opportunity to build up the Canadian strength on our industrial base, on AutoPac 2.0 proposals, on delivering a strategic minerals and energy reserve as a positive incentive in negotiations. We've had over a year to build up our strength to negotiate with Washington and with the world, and we've seen that squandered. And even in these negotiations that we're in right now, the unilateral and unjustified tariffs that President Trump has imposed on Canada is intolerable to all of us. We don't like Canada being used as a punching bag. But let's not forget that we are entering these negotiations on American terms, not terms defined by Canada. These are not the terms that we should be negotiating from a position of weakness. And it's a sad story for the sectors that are involved in the provinces and communities that are dealing with very anxious and existential questions.
I like the way he's framed this, because
It's true.
it's 100% true. Mark Carney, just in the fall, October 2025, and we've shown this, he said, I will get a better deal than the one we have now, which is Kuzma. The best deal in the world.
But we already had the best deal in the world, he was saying.
Right. But he was going to get an even better one. He literally said that on the floor of Parliament.
I know he did.
And now we have CBC saying, well, you know, is it realistic to expect anything other than, you know, some sort of tariff level? Well, wait a minute. Yeah, absolutely. I can expect that. We have the best negotiator on the planet, Mark Carney. That's what we were told. He's the banker. He's the businessman.
You know, I get the feeling he's not really a negotiator as much as he is the guy that barks orders at people.
No, I get the feeling that he just signed on the dotted line and everybody else did the negotiating.
Yeah, well, and that's kind of my point. Like, as the governor of the Bank of Canada or the Bank of England or both, you would think that he'd be the guy giving the orders, but you can't do that in a negotiation. Negotiations are give and take.
No, and the bottom line is the Liberals put us in the situation for 11 years. We wouldn't have been in this weakened position if it weren't for the Liberal Party of Canada.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't have been in this position if it weren't for Mark Carney not doing his job last year.
Well, and again, we had Ambassador Hoekstra tell us that they just walked away from the deal in October. The Canadians just walked away.
There was a deal on the table in the fall.
Yeah. Almost a
Everybody
year
seems
ago.
to agree with that. That's not contested. And you didn't get it done. You didn't get the deal done that you said it was going to be done by July.
Right. So, why? You know a deal needs to be done.
And like I'm not ticked off that if they turn down a bad deal. That's not what I'm ticked off about. I'm ticked off about the fact that Mark Carney set the precedent that he's been conceding all of this time. And now that all of this damage to the economy has been done, now you're going to stand up when you're in this position, when you're in a vice, and now Canadians are going to pay even more. Like, it's just, it blows my mind. Absolutely blows my mind. Get it done. And if you're such a good negotiator, let's get to zero tariffs. Now, why is this being done? Why? Well, we have a theory. And the theory is this. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you didn't know, these tariffs are going into effect on September 8th.
Well,
wait a minute.
That's what, 2 or 3 weeks from now?
It's 2 or 3 weeks from now. Wait a minute. I was told, and everybody was told, no, it wasn't just me. Mark Carney didn't call me up and say, hey, Ryan, guess what? All of us were told by the mainstream media that Carney was ready. He was ready to go in any eventuality, in any situation. So, okay, you say, we're going to be issuing dollar for dollar tariffs later. Why? Oh, wait.
Right.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. I know why. Ladies and gentlemen, on August 31st, 2026, what happens? Well, that is when the by-elections of Beaches, East York, Chicoutimi, Lafjord, and North Vancouver, Capilano, that is when they actually come home to roost. That is voting day. That is results day, folks. So what's interesting is almost a week to the day after that is when he's going to put in these tariffs. I submit to you, Canada, this is my theory, that it'll never happen. I submit to you, this is my prediction, that after those by-elections finish, you're going to see magically within that week a deal struck. Mark Carney is going to say it's because of his threat of the retaliatory tariffs, but I think they're going to go back quietly to the table with the Americans, and we're going to get a deal. And then we're going to see all these capitulations that would cause all these elbows up people to be really ticked off with the Prime Minister, but it won't matter at that point because the by-elections are done.
But there are more coming.
There are more coming. But that's my thought here. Or he's going to call these other by-elections right away, altogether another chunk, wait until they're done, have a 2 or 3 weeks of pain for the Americans, and then we're going to see it. So he can say, elbows up, everybody. That is my prediction. So it's going to be, I think, one of those two scenarios. And I think this is all as a result of maintaining support so he can get through these by-elections. And so that he can try and point at Pierre Poilievre, well, not him, but get everybody else to, and say, oh, look, see the Liberal support? Obviously, the Conservative leader has lost control of his party, and we need, well, they need to get a new leader. That's what they're going to try and spin this as. So, ladies and gentlemen.
Be prepared.
You heard it here first. Maybe.
Maybe.
And if you didn't, then I agree with who else you heard this from. So, I'm not Mark Carney. I won't take credit for everything. I didn't invent the laptop. So that's the theory, that's the thought, and that's the case for it. So, but we've been covering this, as you know, every step of the way, from the 232 tariffs, from the molt, tool, and die, to the trade discussions, up until we were one of the first to actually break the story that the deal was off when it happened. We'll continue breaking this as we come into play. But I can tell you, I've spoken to some people in the Senate, and they don't disagree.